everyone, my name is Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my September wrap-up, which is talking about all of the books that I got to read in the month of September. I'm going to try to make this speedy because I did end up reading 20 books this month, which is quite a bit. I read quite a few good books this month, some average, some not so much, so there's quite a range, and I broke the books up by genre. So I'm going to start with the sci-fi mystery thriller, and I read 3 books kind of that fit that description. The first one being The Hawthorne Legacy by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This is the second book to the Inheritance Games now duology. I don't know if the series is going to continue. This is a young adult mystery novel, kind of a whodunit. I read the first one in August and I gave it 3 stars. I liked it overall, but it wasn't a standout, and this book actually came out in the month of September. The second one, just decided to pick it up as an audiobook, and I gave it 2 stars. I didn't enjoy it as much. The overall plot of this book is it's about a teenage girl whose mother died and she lives with her stepsister, and her father's a deadbeat, and she's going to school and she's quite smart, but she's poor and she's had to live out of her car and she doesn't really know what she wants to do or where she wants to go to college, etc. Out of nowhere, there is a billionaire, gazillionaire in Texas who died, and he has left her an inheritance, basically the entirety of his fortune, and he disinherited his own family, and so she has to go live in Texas in this mansion and deal with his family and all of the different heirs who have been not included in the inheritance now. And there's some games that she has to play and like clues she has to solve, and it was fine. The first book, again, I enjoyed it overall, but it was fine, and this book just went worse for me. I think I'm realizing I'm not a young adult reader. Like, I can handle middle grade because those are more fun, and maybe some young adult, but this one felt so young, and I was so annoyed with like the love triangles. She was falling for this one and this one, and they're just like making out everywhere. Like, I just found myself going, oh, like cringing. Also, it's cloudy, so the light's gonna be like getting bright and then dark and whatever. So anyways, I just didn't love it. The youthfulness of it, the young teenage angst, and honestly the plot and like the mystery was subpar for me. I didn't find myself caring about how the events unfolded. That's just me, and a lot of people love the series, but I could kind of take it or leave it. The next kind of mystery thriller is actually a sci-fi, and it is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is a beloved booktube darling. A lot of people who read mystery thrillers and sci-fi love this book and talk about it all the time. I picked it up in September for Buzzwordathon because the prompt was to read books with dark in the title. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, maybe like a 3.5. This is a book about a man who is living his life, and then one day he gets kidnapped and abducted and like pushed through this weird box, and turns out he is pushed into an alternate reality. And then his goal is to figure out what's going on, what happened, and how to get back to his other life. This book is a survival story, and the mystery is figuring out what's going on. The part that kind of brought it down for me is this multiverse, alternate reality sci-fi-ness of this book. That's a problem that I'm having with it. I think I'm just like too stupid to wrap my mind around that. It's just something that goes over my head and I don't fully grasp. This book kind of was on the same lines as Inception or maybe Interstellar, like that alternate reality, what is truth, what happened kind of thing. It was very fast-paced, which I enjoy about these kinds of books, and I overall really liked it. And then the last mystery thriller that I picked up is Falling by TJ Newman. This is a newer release that came out this year. Also a very intense, fast-paced mystery thriller suspense novel about a hijacked plane. So this book follows a pilot. He has a last-minute trip that he needs to go on, and then as he is leaving, the terrorists abduct his family, his wife and his children, and hold them hostage, figure out a way to communicate him while he's flying the plane, and basically say, if you do not crash this plane into the specific building we tell you to and kill everyone on board, we're going to kill your family. So it's a very high stakes, intense, short time period book where the pilot is trying to figure out what to do and how to save his family, but also be a good human and not kill all these people on the plane. And another aspect to this book that I actually found very interesting was another main character is a flight attendant, and how she is dealing with kind of the events that are unfolding. The actual author of this book, TJ Newman, is a flight attendant, so I feel like a lot of that language that she put into the book is true to what would happen on an actual plane. So it felt very realistic actually to what was going on. So I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. I have a hard time really giving any mystery, thriller, suspense books 5 stars because they're all really great, but they're not like, I'm gonna be like thinking about that book forever kind of thing. But this was up there. This was up there with one of the best suspense mystery thriller books I've ever read. And I would say it was also fairly clean. Besides like a bit of language here and there, there wasn't really any like sexual content or like explicit stuff, unlike Dark Matter, which included a lot more language and sexual content. But yeah, this one was fun. I really enjoyed it. Obviously, like, trigger warning for hijacked planes. I think it was sort of like if 9/11 was to happen in 2021, there was a lot of reference to 9/11 and flying and traveling in a post 9/11 world in this book, which was interesting. But yeah, this was a good one if you like those kinds of books. And then moving into nonfiction, I read 5 nonfiction books. Actually, I read 4, DNF'd 1. And speaking of 9/11, I'll talk about The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history of 9/11 by Garrett M. Graff. This book was incredible, an easy 5-star. I read this alongside with Amanda from The Curly Reader, Lindsay from Lindsay's Little Library, and Krista from Books and Jams. We had a live discussion. I'll link that down below. On 9/11, we talked about this book and kind of some takeaways and stuff that we learned. It was absolutely great to read alongside those ladies. I was really young when 9/11 happened. I was 6 years old and I'm on the West Coast, so when 9/11 was happening, I was probably asleep, and I don't have any really recollection of that day or what that meant for me because I think I was just too young and no one really told me what was going on. And this book really breaks down kind of what happened and what was going on and how communication was being spread. It also gave really interesting perspectives of what was happening on Air Force One with George Bush and his Secret Service and Chief of Staff team, and then also what was happening in the Pentagon. Those 2 perspectives is something that I'd never learned about or really hear about. You know, we just hear about the Twin Towers, and this book does talk about the Twin Towers in detail and their survivors and the different people that were involved. It made me cry easily. Like, this was very, very hard. This was hard on the heart, but also so important. It was so good. This paired alongside with 9/11 One Day in America, the documentary that National Geographic put out. My husband and I watched that 6-part miniseries. Both of those together, we just learned so much. That documentary was wild because it was footage that I just have never seen before. It made us have a lot of conversations, think about that day, talk about that day, understand what happened on that day, and really how it completely changed our world and changed our lives forever living in a post 9/11 world. Very interesting, very fascinating. So well done. Would highly recommend. Along the same lines, I picked up The Red Bandana, A Life, a Choice, a Legacy by Tom Rinaldi. This is a short little book about Wells Crowther, who was a young man in the towers who ended up dying during 9/11. He was working in the finance world in like the trading area, but he had firefighting experience and training. He had the opportunities to get out of the building, but he instead decided to help others evacuate and help clear the building, and eventually was in it when it collapsed. This book is about his childhood, growing up, how he acted as a person and like the choices that he made, and then ultimately how he saved others and sacrificed his life for others. It was very specific to just his story and his life, and it was really great. I gave it 4 stars. I then picked up Night by Elie Wiesel. Now you're gonna see that I read a lot of series and books in series in the month of September. I was doing that for series September. At the end, I'll go over my bingo board and what I was able to accomplish, but Night was one of them. I've been wanting to reread this. I read this in school forever ago and I remember really loving it, and I wanted to reread it, and this worked for a couple things. This worked for a first book in the series because this is actually a trilogy, and this book also worked for the prompt for reading a book in translation for Chantel's Read Your Bookshelf Challenge this year. This was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars again. This is a really short memoir by Elie Wiesel and his Holocaust experience. He was a survivor from the concentration camps, and it is also very tough and hard to read, but also very important. Now, I had every intention to read Dawn and Day, which are 2 historical fiction works by the author. So Night is nonfiction, his memoir, and then Dawn and Day are 2 historical fiction, just small short stories that he wrote. And I started reading Dawn and couldn't do it. I just found myself really put off. It follows the mind of a terrorist living in Israel wanting to commit terrorist acts. I think that maybe I just really wasn't in the right headspace for that, maybe specifically after reading all those 9/11 books, but I was very put off and disturbed and just didn't want to read it. So I DNF'd Dawn, and I just had no interest in continuing with reading Day. So Night, the nonfiction, I would 100% recommend, and the other 2, again, it could have just been me. They were also very like philosophical and stream of consciousness from this like extreme terrorist point of view, a man who had survived the Holocaust, but he's now living in Israel and wanting to commit acts against people, and I couldn't do it. So that was my DNF in the series. I didn't finish it, but Night by itself I think is great. And then finally, nonfiction, I listened to Lessons from Plants by Beronda Montgomery. This was my first book that I was approved for on NetGalley to review. NetGalley is a website that people use to request books ahead of time of their published date. A lot of book reviewers and people on BookTube use it. I was very surprised that I was approved, but I was approved, and this was a short 4-hour audiobook, and this book landed at like a 2.5 for me, so I rounded up to 3 stars. It was okay overall. I like the idea of this book, but I found it too scientific in some parts where I got very bored by how plants work. I mean, at the same time, it was too general. This book is kind of, I think, meant for like business leaders. The main kind of takeaways is like diversifying and figuring out how to best lift up an individual in whatever situation they're in, but it really fell short. There wasn't any practical advice, tips, tricks, how-tos. It was just general concept like plants do this, and isn't that cool how plants diversify and communicate? Well, you should do that in your workplace. Like, it sort of was kind of cheesy in that way, but it wasn't terrible. I just don't know if I really would recommend this to anyone. I don't know if I have anyone in my life that'd be like, wow, that's the book for you. So yeah. All right, let's get into historical fiction. My most read genre, I've read 11 historical fiction books this month. So I'm gonna go from my lowest rated to my highest rated, starting with Our Woman in Moscow by Beatriz Williams. Now, I kind of went on this spree in September for some reason to just really pick up the new historical fiction books that kind of came out this year. So that's the reason I picked this book up, and it was one of the books that I want to read that are set in Russia and Ukraine. I have a whole video about those books. I'm overall glad I still picked this up, but I gave this book 2 stars because I just found the character so unlovable and I had a very hard time caring. This book is essentially an espionage novel. It's also primarily romance as well, and I just had a lot of issues with it. It follows 2 sisters, Iris and Ruth, and there's 2 timelines that eventually converge. So it starts when they are young, in their 20s, living in Italy abroad, and the world is right on the brink of war, so it's right before World War II has started. One of the sisters is more outgoing and rambunctious, and one is more quiet and calm and reserved, and the more calm and quiet one ends up falling for a man who's maybe not the best for her, and he has some like political stuff going on, and he's really into communism, and the 2 sisters have a falling out. The one that goes for the man decides to stay behind in Europe, and the other one goes back to New York. Then this book jumps 12 years later in the 1950s, and the sister who has married this diplomat man is living in Russia. He has defected, so he was a spy, and the other sister is sent to Russia to go retrieve her sister and kind of uncover what happens. It's espionage, it's a little bit of mystery and figuring stuff out. It's also, like I said, primarily romance. There's a lot of like falling for the right kind of guy in here. I don't know, I just found it, I didn't like the characters. It's a lot of sexual content. There was so much sex in this book. It was like too much. A lot of just like drunken behavior, men being really stupid, a lot of infidelity. There's a lot of things that I just don't like about books that was in this book. So that's why I gave it 2 stars. It wasn't like absolutely terrible. Like, I didn't hate it. It was just fine, but I wouldn't really recommend it, you know? So there's a lot of better books out there. Then I read The Forest of Vanishing Stars by Kristin Harmel. This is her newest 2021 release. I saw that Kristin from Books and Jams gave it 5 stars. She loved this book. Unfortunately, I did not feel the same way. I gave this book 2 stars, and I feel a little bit guilty about it. But this book is about a woman who was kidnapped when she was 2 years old by like an old weird witch lady, and she grew up living in the forest and learning survival skills. And then this old witch lady dies, leaves her behind right when World War II broke out, and this woman then meets Jews who are fleeing from concentration camps and from Poland from the Nazis and are trying to survive in the forest. But she, of course, is their savior. She's the one that is teaching them skills to survive, how to hunt, how to gather food, how to build shelter correctly. So she befriends and becomes a part of this Jewish group of people who are trying to survive, and they really become her family. There's also some love interest and love triangles going on, and there's also this like want to try to find her real parents who she was abducted from. Now, I couldn't buy the story. I really didn't like this like weird old witch lady that kidnapped her and brought her to the woods. I just had trouble believing in that. And there's also a little bit of, not necessarily supernatural, but a little bit of this like sixth sense that this old woman and now this young woman who's in this book had, and she just like knows how to do everything and she just senses things and almost has this like sight in the future, which also I sort of just didn't buy. Now, Defiance is one of my absolute favorite movies, and I didn't realize it was based on a book. The author's note actually mentioned that that movie was a big inspiration for this book. The movie Defiance, with Daniel Craig as the main character, is based on a true story of this big group of Jews that got up to 1,000 people that ended up surviving the war by living and surviving in the woods, and their story is absolutely incredible. The movie is heart-wrenching but so good. Now, if this book was about a woman who had to flee and survive in the woods with this group of fellow Jewish survivors, I would buy that story. But all the other stuff just bothered me because it just felt very unrealistic and unnecessary. Like, the true story of those Jewish survivors is already very fascinating, and I just didn't like how the author added all those like weird stuff that just bothered me. I had issues with it, but again, that's a me thing. Next up, I read The Rose Code by Kate Quinn. This is an author that I've been meaning to read from. I do have the Alice Network that I still need to read and The Huntress, but decided to pick up her 2021 release. I landed on 2.5 stars for this book, rounded up to 3 in Goodreads. In this book, there are 3 women and it follows their 3 separate perspectives. They are kind of a group of unlikely friends. One is rich and well off. One grew up in kind of like the slums and poor community of London. And one woman comes from a religious family, and she was told her whole life that she is stupid and she's gonna like stay at home and only take care of her parents, and she's kind of a good for nothing and she's really not allowed to go do anything. So she has like some social anxiety and social behavior issues. And these 3 women come together and become friends because they all start working for Bletchley Park, which is this underground secret part of the UK military where they decoded German codes, the Enigma. So it's set during World War II, and these women have to kind of break codes and work in that community, and they're really not allowed to tell anyone what they're doing for the war. No one really knows, but it's about their lives and then individually their romantic pursuits. And easily the most interesting story for me was Osla, who was the debutante and one of the richer women, because there's this whole aspect to the book of her relationship with Prince Philip, which was very interesting. I actually don't know if she's based on a real character who had a relationship with Prince Philip. That part was really interesting, and I also really liked Mab's story with her husband as well. That was all very sweet and hard. The actual part of like the code breaking and working for the war, and there's also a little bit of like an espionage thing happening, like someone betrayed them and an undercover thing. That part I could go without, which is what brought the book way down. If it was just like the story of these women, I probably would have liked this a lot more. So I don't know, that's why I gave it 3 stars. I really liked some aspects of it and I really didn't like some parts, so they kind of balanced each other out and it just became an average book for me. Another newer historical fiction that I picked up is The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. It's a very hyped book that a lot of people are talking about, that a lot of people love, and I gave it 3 stars. I overall liked it, but didn't like fall in love with the characters or the story. This book also has 2 timelines. It starts with a woman in present day who just discovered that her husband is cheating on her, but she decides to go to England, which was a trip that they had planned by herself. And she is a historian, and she uncovers this old apothecary bottle in like the sand on the river and decides to kind of uncover its origins, which jumps back to the past to this apothecary who had this secret shop in London in 1791, and she distributed bottles of poison and different ways to kill off men. So women would come to her secretly asking for some kind of remedy to basically eliminate an unwanted male presence, usually someone's husband, because they either cheated on them or were terrible, or etc, etc. And then she ends up like weirdly getting an apprentice who is this 12-year-old girl who wants to become like her and learn all her trade secrets, and starts like helping her out. And I just couldn't buy it. That's the main thing that brought this down. I just had a really big problem with this 12-year-old girl who's apparently like so capable of all this stuff and had to deal with all of these things. And yeah, I just didn't like some aspects of this book. It was an enjoyable reading experience, just not my favorite, and won't really be like a memorable standout for me. I also read The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Shaffer and Annie Barrows. This is a book that has been beloved for a while because of the movie that came out several years ago, and I did watch that movie. I really didn't remember anything that happened in it, so I kind of felt like I was going into this book blind. I also gave this book just 3 stars. I think it's because I didn't feel like I had enough time with the characters. This book is an epistolary novel, so it is just a series of letters, which in one sense is very interesting, and I liked that, but at the same time I felt like I needed more. I felt like I didn't get enough, and I wanted to like sit in and experience what these characters were doing versus them just writing a letter explaining some moment that happened. It just felt too short, too brief to dive in and like love the people and the story. So I feel like if it was longer and more drawn out and I could sit with the characters a bit more, I would have loved it, but I just liked it. So that's what brought it down. If I didn't explain the plot, and if you don't know, this book is set on the Guernsey island, which is an island in the English Channel, kind of in between France and England. And the timeline is right after the war ended and people are kind of grieving and dealing with the repercussions of World War II. This woman ends up befriending these people who live on the island, and we're reading books together. So she decides to travel there and write a book about their experience during World War II, because this island was occupied by the Nazis. And she ends up kind of learning about all of the different people and the different characters and their different lives, and she ends up wanting to stay there. So this book is more about this like found family kind of feel. It was sweet, it was light, also kind of sad at the same time because, you know, World War II. But yeah, I just wanted a little bit more. Now, I read 2 books in the Outlander series, Dragonfly and Amber, which is book 2, and Voyager, which is book 3. I read Outlander for the first time like 5-6 years ago, and I loved it, and then I reread it for a second time and I loved it again, and I watched the first season of the show, which is based off the first book. Love all of that, and I've been wanting to continue the series. I've had these 2 books on my shelf for a very long time. Because it was series September and I was encouraged to pick up books in this series, I decided, you know what, this is the time to read these big chunky books. And I did. I read 2 and 3, and I think overall both of these books sit at 3.5 stars. So the first book was definitely a 5-star read for me. These were, I liked them overall, but they weren't like incredible. I definitely want to continue the series. I'm already reading the 4th book, and I hope to make it in time because at the end of November, the 9th book in the series comes out. Now, I'm still obsessed with Jamie and Claire's relationship. That's the main thing kind of keeping me going through these books. They're very long. They're very like political at the same time. This one I found quite boring because it was set in France and it had to deal with like all the French politics, and I just kind of could care less about some aspects of this book. And then this book I enjoyed much more than the second one. It kind of reignited my interest, and I'm not going to really say what happens because really anything that I say I feel like will give stuff away. But basically, if you don't know, Outlander is this epic love story, romance, historical fantasy book set in Scotland, and then this is the continuation. And Claire and Jamie are this just like really cool power couple, and they're really fun to root for, and this series just chronicles their lives and like all of the epic adventures that they get up to, and the author kind of made them like quite pivotal in a lot of historical moments that are happening in the timeline. It's set in the 1700s and then jumps to kind of present day and kind of goes back and forth. So there is an element of time travel in these books, but it's just subtle enough that it literally almost seems believable, and it doesn't like take away from the story for me because I'm not big in like sci-fi time travel stuff, but it works for me in these books. But yeah, read these 2, planning to continue. Feels good to knock those off my list. And then I have 4 books that I all gave 4 stars to. I'll start with Yours Cheerfully by A.J. Pearce. This is also a 2021 historical fiction release. In August, I read Dear Mrs. Bird by the same author, which is the first book in this duology, and I absolutely loved it. A new favorite. It was really like the perfect book, and I probably won't stop talking about it. This is the second book in that story, and the story just picks up right where that second book left off. But I gave this book 4 stars. It wasn't as good as the first because this book is just kind of its own story, but I still really enjoyed it. If you don't know, Dear Mrs. Bird was about a woman named Emmeline, and it's set during World War II in London during the Blitz, and she wants to become a wartime writer, but the only available position to work for a newspaper is to work for an advice column. In the first book, she kind of gets up to some trouble writing for the advice column, and there's also like very sweet and wholesome love and romance and also tragedy. I thought both that book and this book, the author did a really good job of writing friendship. In this one, the main character is writing articles to encourage women to join the war effort. So she goes to a factory and starts interviewing women that work there and kind of their experiences, and really uncovering that there's stuff that could be changed and made better for these women who are putting in work for the war. So this book has like some feminist threads in that sense, but overall Dear Mrs. Bird and this one were great reads, and yeah, I would really recommend. Then I picked up The War That Saved My Life by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, and the second book in this duology, The War I Finally Won. These 2 books are also set in the UK during the Blitz. I feel like I read a lot of books about that this month. Technically, both of these books are middle grade, or I mean, my library categorizes them as young teens, so it's sort of like right on the brink of middle grade and young adult. But this story follows a young 10-year-old girl and her coming of age story. Her name is Ada, and she was born with a club foot, and she was born to a very impoverished family, a single mother that is really abusive and has kind of like in a Cinderella way locked her up in her room and has never let her leave the house or anyone see her. She's very ashamed of her. And then war breaks out, and in London all of the kids that were in the city were moved away to the countryside. They were evacuated and were taken in by families and people living in the countryside to kind of save them from the bombs that were eventually dropped on London. I think my first exposure to knowing that history was in Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The kids in that story go to live in the professor's house because they are also leaving London because of the Blitz. Anyways, then this girl, who also has a younger brother, live with this woman who has her own kind of stuff that she's dealing with. And both of these books just chronicle basically the whole time of the war and kind of coming of age and the different friends that they made in the countryside. But more than anything, and what I think this author did an absolutely incredible job of, is writing childhood trauma. Both of these books mainly deal with the trauma that this young girl has dealt with her life and how she just doesn't know how to accept herself and her newfound family and her new circumstances. And I think that both of these books were very deep and layered and made me think a lot. And I feel like for a younger audience, imagine someone reading this, they would have a lot to unpack and a lot to learn and take away from. And I thought, yeah, that both of these were very well written and very interesting, and I'm glad I read them. And the final historical fiction book that I read in the month of September is The Nesting Dolls by Elena Adams. This is also a book that I put in the video books that I want to read that have to do with Russia and Ukraine, and Anne McNulty commented that she wants to buddy read this along with me, and so we buddy read it in September. I was a really bad buddy reader and just kind of forgot to read and check in with her, but she was great at checking in. I'll link her channel down below. I'm so glad that we are booktube friends. Both of us really enjoyed this book and we both gave it 4 stars, so that's great. It was a successful read for both of us. This book is a multi-generational story, so it follows one family line but 3 different women and 3 different generations. So it starts in the 1930s with a woman named Daria who was from Odessa, but she was banished and exiled to Siberia with her family, and it's her survival story. That part was by far, I think, the most interesting in this book and the most captivating. And then it skips a generation and it's her granddaughter's story back in Odessa in the 1970s and her kind of dealing with living in the Soviet Union after the war and the communist threads and the anti-Semitism in the city. And her story was less interesting for me. She's a very flawed character in my opinion, and I had a hard time relating to her and rooting for her because just some of her thoughts and actions really bothered me. And then it jumps to Brighton Beach, New York, and it's her granddaughter's story, Zoe, in 2019. And that by far is the character that I could relate to the most because it's this young woman in her 20s who's an American and she has to balance out kind of living as an American but also has this cultural and family kind of pressure on her. There was some similarities with how this family had to deal with living in Soviet Russia, and my parents lived in the Soviet Union and my parents immigrated from Odessa in 1989, so there was definitely some aspects that I could relate to, and I really liked how the author included some Russian words in the book as well. I found this thoroughly enjoyable and I thought it was well written, and I don't know if I'm just biased because I have that cultural aspect to it that I found so relatable. I feel like maybe if I didn't at all, I would probably rate this just a little bit lower because the characters kind of were unlovable and annoying at sometimes, and I'm a big character person when it comes to book. They kind of make or break it for me. So yeah, if you're at all interested in like Soviet Russia and like the implications of living there and all of the stuff, I feel like you would enjoy this one. And last but not least, I read one graphic novel that's actually a classic, and that is The Secret Garden, the graphic novel by Maria Marsden. She wrote the Anne graphic novel that I read earlier in the summer, and it was very sweet. This is a very sweet illustrated book. This was a totally random pick. I just literally saw it in my library, and I've never read The Secret Garden. I have no idea what the story's about. I read it in one sitting and then I checked out The Secret Garden. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I do want to read that in October. I know it's more of like a spring book, but whatever. I just read books when I feel like reading them. This was a good introduction to The Secret Garden, which is a classic children's story, but it's just about this little orphan girl and her befriending a sick boy, and also kind of a found family aspect, and at the same time she wants to cultivate and grow this garden. She has a lot of curiosity and wonder of the world. It also just feels very sweet and wholesome and coming of age, and yeah, I thought it was very nice. So those are all of the books, and to wrap it up, I wanted to go over quickly what I read specifically for series September, which is is a bingo board that Krista from Books and Jams and Sarah from Sarah's Nightstand made, and these challenges is what I tried to fulfill with all the series books I read. So for starting a series, I read Night, which is technically the beginning of a series, and The War That Saved My Life, which is also the beginning of the series. Two books in the same series, I read Dragonfly and Amber and Voyager, which are part of the Outlander series. Newest series purchased, that one I just kind of skipped because I haven't purchased any series books, so that one was a pass for me. Didn't make that one. Series that is longer than 5 books, also the 2 books in the Outlander series. Finish a series, technically I read The War That Saved My Life and The War I Finally Won. Those are 2 books in one series, as well as the Dear Mrs. Bird and Yours Cheerfully. Second book in a series, I read Yours Cheerfully, The War That I Finally Won, and Dragonfly and Amber. Those are all both second books. Book in a duology, same thing. Dear Mrs. Bird and The War That Saved My Life, those are both duologies, and maybe the Hawthorne Legacy. I don't know if that's going to be a duology or if it's going to be a series continuation at this point, but I read that one. Most recently started series, that one I also fulfilled with Yours Cheerfully and the Hawthorne Legacy, because both of those books I started in August and continued reading in September. And then series started more than a year ago. That's also the Outlander ones, because I started Outlander like 5 years ago and just finally got to books 2 and 3. That's my bingo board, everything but one. Feel good about that, no big deal. So yeah, thanks so much for watching and for tuning in. I always appreciate your guys' love, support, likes, comments, subscribing, all of the things. I really appreciate it. Although I am a summer gal through and through, I'm very excited for this fall and for all of the good books that I'm hoping to get to. There's just so much reading to get done and I'm very excited. And I will see you guys with another book video soon. Bye!